Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Gateways Musical Podcast. This is Gateways episode 12, continuing in our series on rhythm and how it can be used more effectively in your musical pieces. So today we're going to be covering more of the fun stuff that music teachers don't like you knowing, and because they think it's irrelevant and not important, even though it's really interesting. And if you recall, in the last episode we were talking a lot about time signatures, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper in time signatures, and we're going to start discussing things called polyrhythms, which you can use to make your musical pieces a bit more diverse and a bit more interesting. So let's start off with the time signature segment. So we're going to be talking about what are called irrational meters, or irrational time signatures. Now, what are irrational time signatures? Well, it's because the denominator of whatever of your time signature, so like the number on the bottom, is not a power of 2, it is considered irrational. So, an example of a rational time signature would be something like 4/4 or 4/8 or like 3/32. Those are all considered rational because they're all powers of 2. However, if you were to make something like 4/3 or like 3/24, anything that's not a power of 2 is considered irrational. Which, is something very, very interesting. Now, how exactly would you write in an irrational time signature? Well, let's take a look at an example. So you have a time signature of 4/2. That means that there are 4 beats, and every beat is... Well, no, that's not an easy way to explain it. Okay, you have 4 half notes within a single bar. You're in 4/2, right? But if you're in 4/3, then all of those half notes are now triplets, right? So, because there are 4 third notes per measure, which is 1/3 of a whole note, well, that's a half note triplet. So that means that if you are to properly create a section in 4/3, all of the half notes would need to be triplets, because you need 1/3 of a whole note. Now in 4/2, this is negated. You only need the 4 half notes. Now, why would you use these irrational time signatures? What's the point of them? Well, you don't need to use it. It's definitely not a necessity. It can add some interesting flavor to the musical piece you're making, especially if you perform like a metric modulation within the piece. It could, spice up the rhythm that you have and make it like a moment of interest to the reader. Not to the reader, to the listener. This is music, we're not talking about books. But it's something that it's interesting to look into, and it's interesting to use. And then you can also say that you wrote an entire piece in 4/20, which we all know is very important to know how to do. So if you want to learn some more about these irrational time signatures and how to use them, again, great person I'd recommend viewing once again is Andrew Huang, he is good for viewing, but not for this. If you want to view stuff on irrational time signatures, then you're going to want to be looking at Adam Neely again. I know that he did an entire series on irrational time signatures just because he felt like it, and a very large part of it was he got to make a 7/11 time signature, and there was a whole contest about it. It was really interesting. You should go check it out. But for implementation in your music, personally, I'd recommend using them to create moments of... Oh no! The 7-11 thing was polyrhythms, my mistake. He did a section on how you would write a piece of music in 4/20, which the way you do that is every bar would have 4 quarter note quintuplets. It's a measure of 4/20, and he talks about how he used it in one of his pieces in his band's album, Sungazer Volume 1, I believe. So you should go check that out if you haven't already, just to like further understand the kind of confusing nature of irrational time signatures and where they can be used. Personally, I have used them before to the dismay of my music theory teacher, and I think that they really spice up the rhythm of a piece, especially if it's a metric modulation where you shift to these new and different, rhythmic ideas. Like that change, even if it can be like a little startling, it's really interesting. So, moving on from that segment, let's start talking about what are polyrhythms, right? So, polyrhythm is when like 2 or more rhythms are not readily perceived as deriving from one another. Now that's like a complex way of saying it. It's essentially you have 2 rhythms playing simultaneously, and each kind of arrives at a specific point, right? So let's say you have a polyrhythm which is 2 to 3, right? So it would kind of represents like on one hand you're snapping along to like the 3, on the other hand you're snapping along to 2. And the way it works is kind of be like they both start at 1, then you have the 2 and the 3rd in the like 1 of 3 rhythm. You have the 2 and the 1 of 2 rhythm. You have the 3 and the 1 of 3 rhythm, and then they both end on 1 again. So, if you were to represent this, it would probably be like you have like the initials like 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3. So that creates an interesting rhythmic effect, especially if like these are 2 separate instruments playing this rhythm. It can create really interesting effects, and it's actually been used a decent amount throughout history. It's been used across, Western art music. It's been used in like sub-Saharan African music. It's been used a lot in jazz. It's very good to keep in mind. Like if you want some examples of like Western music, there's a polyrhythm in Beethoven Symphony Number 3, which is interesting to look at. I believe there's also one in his string quartet number 6, which is interesting. And then, in jazz generally, it's been used a lot. I mean, you can listen to something like Afro Blue by Mongo Santa Maria. He was built on a 6/4 cross rhythm, so it's like 2 cycles of 3/2. You can listen to that one if you want an example of polyrhythm. You also have like Elvin Jones did a jazz waltz with a polyrhythm of 2/3, which was really interesting. You have John Coltrane's recording of Afro Blue with Elvin Jones, where you get this like polyrhythmic feel. It's really interesting. Now, like, what's the point? What's the point of a polyrhythm? Well, it's like, I mean, the point of anything in music is just to make your music more interesting. But generally, it's a new way of playing, right? So like, because the combination of like 2 different rhythms or more, it like creates like this rhythmic conflict within like single meters, right? And it can be like reinforced simultaneous combinations of conflicting meters. It's something that's just like, it's really interesting to examine. It's really interesting to attempt to understand. But if you're listening to this, you're probably wondering, how can I incorporate this into my music? Well, one, depending on like the genre you're going for, you should be like you should have an understanding of the rhythms used in that genre. Like, if you're going into jazz music, if you're going into things like maybe metal, polyrhythms are incredibly common actually. So, it's good to understand it. So, this segment is going to be, I'm just going to straight up define it now, right? So, polyrhythm is layers of simpler rhythms which are different from one another over one another, played at the same time, with each one containing a different beat subdivision. So like, you have like a bass rhythm, then you have like a second rhythm on top of it, you can have a third, you can have a fourth, entirely up to you. And then what this creates is similarly to harmony, you get this rhythmic tension based on like the rhythm that you have, like these two rhythms that are going against each other. But then the moment that they both hit at the same time, you have that moment of release. Kind of like, dissonance in harmony. The more dissonant it is, the more satisfying that moment of release becomes, right? And it's very expressive. It's very expressive, much more than like a lot of the modern rhythm that's being used today, like 4 on the floor. It just has like this feeling to it, which is a lot of it's in jazz, and that's probably why I like it personally, because I adore jazz as a genre. Just generally, I think that it's really harmonically rich. It's rhythmically complex. It's melodically complex. The level of improvisation is incredible. A lot of the people who made it were very talented, and even if they weren't, like the best of the best, it was still marvelous to listen to that kind of music, in my opinion. And also the fact that these rhythms are present in like, Western music throughout the different eras of Western art music, right? The fact that it's present there shows that, it's not just a part of like jazz. It's a part of the history of Western art music. It's also part of the history of music from like sub-Saharan Africa. It's part of the history of some Asian music. Like, it was most likely used with a lot of Indian rhythm, which directly influenced things like the modern day Japanese style of music, which is kind of cross between the Indian rhythms after their migration north at around like the 6th century when Buddhism began to spread, and then the influence of like Western jazz music during the globalization period and during like American occupation within Japan. And those sounds kind of combine to create, what the modern day Japanese, music, like popular music, that's where it came from. Now, if you want to listen to that, again, another Adam Ailey video, he did a thing on like how J-pop and jazz are related. And then if you want to listen to some more stuff on polyrhythms, like I said previously, there's a 7-Eleven video that he made, which explains it in depth. And then finally, to end off, how would you incorporate this into music? Well, there's the obvious, like you can have a drum groove, you can have like 2 drum sets playing different grooves and hitting at the same time. This is common in a lot of like jazz fusion bands. You can have it be like the drums and the bass are playing different rhythms until like this point of rhythmic release, which would create a really cool effect. If you combine that with kind of like what we talked about yesterday, the like J Dilla drunken feel, it could produce some really interesting grooves that you could go for. And like, you can use it in a melodic sense where you have like a counter melody and a counter melody, which are playing in different rhythmic subdivisions to create not only interesting harmonic choice, but also like furthering the tension that you might be going for that like climatic moment of release. It's entirely up to you how you want to use them and where you want to use them. But I just recommend looking into it, even if you think, I don't want to make jazz. Well, it isn't just for jazz. It can be used honestly for anything. It's just a matter of researching it. So with that being said, that's all we're going to talk about for today. So I want to wish a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for tuning in to Gateways number 12. Goodbye.